Hello everyone and welcome to day 9 of the Stitch Together project. I can't believe we're almost through. Thank you so much for joining me all this way. Today I asked if you guys wanted to learn a particular stitch, so I asked for you to send in your requests. So we've had 2 requests come in. One is long and short stitch and the other one is a stitch called the woven wheel, or sometimes it's called a woven rose, or sometimes it's called a spider web. So I'll get on and show you those stitches in a moment. A couple of you asked some questions as well, just about me and my work and how I learnt embroidery. So someone asked, where did you learn it and what did you have to do to get on the course? So I think I mentioned before that I trained at the Royal School of Needlework, and that was on a degree. So there's a organisation in London called the Royal School of Needlework, and the patron is Camilla, and it used to be, I think, the Queen's mother. So it is a royal business, and yeah, they do a lot of stitching for not only the royal family but all sorts of clients. So it can be anything from military to fashion to weddings. And the idea with the Royal School of Needlework is that everyone is trained in exactly the same way, so that if they need to work on a really big job and they need lots of people to stitch, the stitching looks like it's just been done with one person. So you're all trained exactly the same, really neat and really precise, and yeah, that's where I learnt. To get on the course, I think I needed a portfolio. So essentially what that means is you have to have a small body of work ready to be able to show the course leaders, to kind of give them an idea of your skill and what you're capable of already. So unlike some courses where you have to sit an exam, for art courses quite often they want to see the work that you've already done. And this doesn't have to be lots of stuff, but just kind of so they can get an idea if you're creative, what kind of talent you already have. I hadn't actually done that much embroidery in the first place, so I didn't have a lot of embroidery to show. But I don't think it was a problem because obviously they want to teach you their way of stitching anyway. So the fact that I didn't know much meant that I could learn exactly what they wanted to teach me. So yeah, so if you're interested in getting learning more about embroidery, then definitely look up that course. I think I had to have a A-level in an art or design course to get in. So that's just something to think about if you're thinking of going down that route. And in terms of jobs after you finish the degree, obviously you can work for the Royal School of Needlework if you wanted to. There's a couple of other embroidery houses in the UK that you could work for. However, I think most people kind of set up as their own freelancer sort of jobs, and they just work on odd jobs, commissions, set up their own business. You can work in fashion, you could work in costume, in films or in theatre, or of course you could go into restoration and conservation. I don't know if any of you have seen The Repair Shop, that TV programme. I love that programme. That's the kind of thing that you could learn how to do. Or you might have seen Secrets at the V&A. That's another interesting programme where they repair and restore items that are at the V&A. If you wanted to go into restoration and conservation, you would have to do a master's in that specific area. But a degree in hand embroidery would be like an excellent route into that. So yeah, that's just something to think about. So yeah, I think that was all the questions. If you've got any more questions, feel free to just pop them in the comments, or tomorrow I'm more than happy to answer your questions as well. But we'll just get started. So I'll show you long and short stitch and the woven wheel. And again, scissors and needles are sharp, so please sew responsibly. And I'll just turn this round. And hopefully you can see my desk there. It's a little bit messy. But I've got a new piece of fabric ready for these stitches, just so you can get an idea of what they look like. This is my hot air balloon coming along nicely. I've added a couple more eyelets to it. I actually went with one strand of thread for this one, and I think it looks quite sweet. So I'm really happy with that. So I'm going to add quite a few more. I'm going to take this off and create a little border before I finish. But for now, we'll go for long and short stitch and the woven wheel. So I think I'll show you the woven wheel first. Now I was actually looking through my old university work just to see if I had any examples of this stitch, and I found this little piece of fabric. Now these are just experiments really of me stitching on different bits of thread to my fabric. So we've got cord, we've got metal thread, we've got pearl, we've got some braid I made, and this is called passing thread. Now this is actually a woven wheel which I've outlined with a border. So this is giving you sort of an idea of what it could look like, hopefully if you can see that well enough in the light. So it kind of looks like a 3D rose, so sometimes it's called a woven rose and sometimes they also call it a spider's web. So yeah, that's just an idea of what this could look like. So for the first step of stitching a woven wheel, what you need to do is mark out 5 points on your fabric that go around in a circle. Now the trick with these is they need to be equally spaced. So sometimes you might want to get a circle just to kind of make sure that they're sort of in the right place. So what I might do is just pop that on the fabric and mark out 5 points around this circle just so I know where I'm going to stitch. So I'll stick 1 there, 2, let's see, 3, 4, and then 5. Now hopefully they're not quite evenly spaced, but hopefully you can kind of get an idea of what I mean. So next time I might move these down a bit. Actually, I think I might do that now. So I'm going to move that one there and there. This is a reason why you should always use a pencil when stitching, because you're not going to be able to rub this out. And then the next thing you need to do is mark a center point, okay? So just a dot in the middle of all of those dots. Okay, so I'm going to work with this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. Okay, now it's important that you have an odd number of dots around the edge, and you'll see why in a minute. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch 5 spokes, so this looks like a wheel. So I'm going to get a length of thread. And you can decide to do your spokes in the same colour as your woven rose, or you could do it in a contrasting colour. I don't know if you can see, but in this one I've done an orange cotton centre. You can't always see the spokes, so let's just see how this turns out. It's been a while since I've done one of these. So I've got my 3 strands of thread. Again, you can experiment with how many strands of thread you use. Thread my needle, knot on the end, and I'm going to stitch 5 spokes. So I'll show you what I mean. So come up in the first dot, okay, and down in the center dot. Next, come up in the second dot, and down in the center dot, and you just repeat this all the way around. I think I'm going to go back in this one actually. We'll see how this looks. You might want to get like a protractor out if you want, and you can measure equal distances between these dots. Let's see what this looks like. Not quite even, but close enough. So I'm happy with that. I'm not going to worry too much about these other dots because I can always outline this shape once I'm done. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is just bring that needle up out the way. So I'll get rid of this thread once we're done. Actually, what I think I might do, so I'm just changing my mind as we go, is I might just create 3 little stitches inside one of these spokes, because we're actually going to be covering this whole shape with the woven rose stitch, so we're not going to see these little stitches. So that's a good way of finishing this thread. So I think I mentioned this on day 2, 3 little stitches, And these are anchoring stitches that just hold that thread in place. So give it a tug and snip that bit away. Okay, now for the woven rose part of the stitch, you're going to need a really long piece of thread. It's really hard to know how long you're going to need because it purely depends on how big your circle is. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use this remaining piece of pink thread that I've got, and then when I get to the end I'll just cut off whatever I haven't used. And I'm going to use the whole of the skein, so all 6 threads. And you again can experiment with cords or with ribbon. This is a really nice one to use chunky threads with, because you're not going to be stitching this thread through the fabric lots of times. You're only going to stitch through once. So thread the needle if you can. There we are. Knot in the end. Now you just have to be really careful not to get tangled. Okay, now we're going to bring the needle up from the back of the fabric, and we're going to bring it up really close to the center. So I'm going to bring my needle up just here, so try not to pierce any of your spokes. So right in the center, and then pull that all the way through. And just check the back, because it sometimes gets tangled when you have a really long piece of thread. This is why I don't recommend you have a really long piece of thread when you work most of the time. See if I can untangle that. So there's some knots that I call twist knots, and they're like not real knots, they're just twists in the thread, and you just have to give them a bit of a wiggle. Are we going to get rid of that, or is this going to take a while? See if I can undo this. Some people ask me what do I do for a living, and I tell them that I unwind thread for a living. So what I think I'm going to do, because that's not essential, I'm just going to chop this off. I wouldn't recommend this, but considering you might not want to watch me entangle thread for about 10 minutes, I've just chopped that off. So my length is slightly smaller now, and I need to recreate that knot in the back of the fabric, in the back of the thread. So take 2, back up in that hole, pull it all the way through, check there's nothing tangled on the back. Okay, so all we're going to do for this stitch is go over one spoke and under the other, over, under, over, under. So I'm going to use my needle, I'm going to go over this first spoke and then under this second one. I'm going to pull that thread through, over this next spoke and under that one. Pull that through, over, under, over. And the trick is just to keep pulling it tight, so your stitching, hopefully you can see that, is close to the center, over, under. And this is the reason why it's really important that you have an odd number of spokes, because if you had an even number of spokes, your thread would always go over the same spokes, whereas you want to alternate it in every round. So I'm over that one, I'm under that one, over that one, under that one. And again, I'm just pulling it tight, under that one, over, under. Just have to check I got that right, so that's over that one, under that one. Takes a bit of concentration. But you can start to see it's becoming a very sweet little rose. Hopefully you can see that. I'll just bring that closer. And this is why it works really nice with other cords and ribbons, because they're quite thick, so they bunch up as they go and they give that sort of petal effect. Over, under, over. Under, over. Under, over. hopefully this won't take too long. Over that one, under that one. Under that one, over that one. But you can get the general idea. And then what you can do, like I've done on my example, is you can add a border to the circle. If you wanted to, you could add leaves, petals around the side, so it really does look like a rose. Or if you want to go down the spider's web theme, you could maybe add some backstitch lines coming off it. It's up to you, really. Just get creative. Getting there, building up. Hope this isn't too boring. Over, under, over. Oops, and my thread's come undone. So I've gone and over, under, over, under, over, under. And this is why it's important that your spokes are an equal distance apart, because as you can see here, I've got more of a spoke left here, but less on this one. And that's just because they weren't evenly spaced. So that will just mean that I'll find it difficult when I come to the end of filling in. So I'm almost done with this spoke, but I'm nowhere near done with that one. So this is just a stitch where it's actually good just to experiment, really. I think I could probably still go under one more time, but this is why it's a good idea to add a border, because then if you do make any mistakes like that, you can just cover them up. So we'll do a few more. Over, under. See if I can do one more under there. And there we have it. So that length of thread was just about right, really, for what I'm working with. Still got a little bit left. So I think what I'll do is just finish off. And all you do to finish off is just bring your needle back down through the fabric. So I think I'm going to go down there, or actually here. And you just tie it off at the back. But you'll see on the back, it's just the same as what we left it as, because we haven't done any stitching through the fabric. So all the stitching is on the top. So I'm going to bring my needle through. Just make sure that lays flat. A bit of a wiggle. And there you have it. And what I think I'm going to do is just do a quick back stitch line around this rose, just to go over any of those dots and any of those blue bits of thread that we've missed. So you don't have to do back stitch line, you could do couch line, and that is where you lay the thread on the fabric and you get another piece of thread and stitch over the top. So hopefully this will get rid of all the blemishes and mistakes. We shall see. You might also want to use a stem stitch or a chain stitch or a split stitch. There are so many different options. I think someone asked how many stitches are there. I mean, I wouldn't know. I think there's thousands of them. You can get books which have got lots of different stitches in. And actually, I did get taught a fair amount of stitches whilst at university. However, a lot of them I did learn after I left too, because it's not just impossible to learn them all at once. Okay, nearly there. Keep going. So I quite like this effect. I might go around again just to fill in any white gaps, but I'm pretty happy with how that looks. So if we could just go over that black dot there. And there we have it. A woven rose. So hopefully you've been able to see that. And now all I'm going to do is weave this bit of thread through the back of my stitches just like normal. And then we're done. So hopefully that's been helpful. I think that was Carissa who asked for that one. And again, do just experiment. Make them your own. Okay. So the next stitch I'm going to teach you is long and short stitch. I think it was Anna who asked to see this one. Now long and short stitch is a perfect stitch for filling in big shapes or for shading. So quite often you see this stitch used on birds or animals, or really fine embroidery. There's a technique called silk shading and they use this stitch a lot. And it's essentially when you shade with thread, and some people also call it painting with a needle. So it's a really lovely technique to know how to do. And it's one of those that takes a bit of patience. You have to use your eye a lot to kind of gauge where colours should go and where your stitches should go. But I'll just show you really simply how it works. So I'm going to use 2 colours of blue and I'm going to show you how to actually shade using both of these colours. And I've got a little shape here. I'm just going to outline it in black. Oh, thanks, Janet. It's a lovely stitch, the woven rose. So I'm just going to outline this shape in black. A little bit wobbly, but be okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stitch an outline around this shape. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want it to have a really smooth edge. Okay, you can do this when you stitch satin stitch as well. If you want to have a really smooth edge to a shape, all you need to do is stitch a split stitch outline. A split stitch, very simple stitch. I'm going to use 2 strands of thread so it's not really thick. And I'm going to use my smaller needle. Oops. And all I'm going to do is thread that needle and tie a knot in the end. And then I'm going to create my 3 little stitches inside this shape, just so I can anchor my thread and cut my knot away. Oops. So 1, 2, 3. And then I'm just going to pull on that. Seems secure, so I'm going to cut that away. Okay, so a split stitch is a stitch where the thread gets split. So again, like I said, it's all in the name. I'm going to start my stitch at the point. Doesn't really matter where you start, but it makes sense for me to start at the point. I'm just going to stitch around this shape. So bring my needle down. I'm going to bring my needle up halfway through that stitch and I'm going to split the thread as I bring it up. Okay, so I don't know if you can see that. So I've split that thread and create another stitch. Bring my needle up halfway through that last one, split the thread and create another stitch. And this is a great way of creating an outline without having sort of any sharp edges. And again, like with back stitch, make your stitches smaller as you go around a curve. Oops. Okay. And I'll just show you an example of long and short stitch in a second. Again, another one that I did whilst I was at university. So I'm just moving my hoop around as I'm stitching just to help me out a bit. Split that thread. And I usually do the outline. If you're filling a shape with lots of different shades, I usually choose the mid shade to do the outline, or I'll do the outline in the colour that's most prominent. And that's just because if for some reason your stitches show through, you want to disguise this outline as much as possible. So it's best to do it in the colour that's most readily used, and then hopefully it'll blend in. So have I split that? I'm just going to take that one out. Try again. So as you can see, it looks like a little running stitch on the back. Okay. Now this is a good one to sort of practice. It's good to practice in little shapes before you move on to big shapes. But if you are going to do like a flower or a bird in this technique, I always recommend that you start with the motifs or the section of the animal that is in the background of the design first. And what I mean by that is the part of the design that sits at the back. I hope that makes sense. So not the elements that are at the foreground. And that is just because if the elements overlap, what you'll find is that you want the elements at the front to sort of overlap the edge of the other elements. So you always start at the back. I hope that makes sense. I've kind of gone about that slightly backwards. But yeah, so here we are. We've got our split stitch outline. So that's nice and smooth. And again, I'm just going to weave this bit of thread through the back of my stitches. Okay. 1, 2, 3 times. Pull that and then cut it away. Now what I'm going to do, just to show you, is I'm actually going to draw on this piece, this motif, how my stitches are going to look. So like with every stitch, it's all in the name. Long and short stitch, you stitch one long stitch, then a short stitch, then a long stitch, then a short stitch, then a long stitch. Okay, that's all there is to it. But we're going to shade, so we're going to do stitches in rows. So we're going to do one row of long and short, and then another row, and then another until we get to the point. And I tend to start on the widest part of the design. Some people do it differently, but I find it's easier to start on the widest part and then narrow down to a smaller part. Lots of people like to do this stitch with just one strand of thread, but I recommend if you're just beginning, use 2 or 3, just because you'll be there forever otherwise. It's purely all there is to it. Okay, so I mentioned I was going to show you an example, so I'll just tie this knot. So on this little piece I've done here, I've got 2 versions of long and short stitch, and this is all gold work as well, which is another technique of embroidery. But here, I don't know if you can see that, but that square has been shaded from dark orange to light orange, and then again with this sort of leaf shape, we've got a pale green and a dark green. And these are 2 different types of long and short, so you've got sort of straight shading and then curved shading. That's not the technical name, but you can either shade in straight lines or you can mimic the shape of the motif that you're stitching. Okay, so I'm going to start with my darker thread. So I've got this dark thread here. I've got this one and this one that I'm using. This one's got a bit tangled. I usually try and pick colours that sort of match in tone, or whatever you like really. You can do different colours if you wanted to. Oops. And again, I'm going to bring my needle down and create 3 little stitches inside this motif. And these again are anchoring stitches, so they're just holding that thread in place. So I'm going a bit wobbly. Okay, I'm actually going to switch to my smaller needle because I'm creating quite big holes. And check that, cut that knot away. Right, so grab your needle. Right, so first stitch, I'm going to start in the centre of the motif. So I'm going to stitch 1 long stitch over the edge of my split stitch outline. Okay, now I'm going to work from the centre to the left, and then I'm going to come back to the centre and work out to the right. And I think I've mentioned this before, but this is just to make sure that my stitches are going in the right direction that I want them to. Okay, I'm going to make my short stitches just a little bit longer than I've drawn. But my next stitch is going to be a shorter stitch. Bring it up next to the first one and down over the split stitch outline. And then again, do a long stitch over the outline and then a short stitch over the outline. long, and then short. And you'll find, because this shape curves round, that you'll just have to go with the kind of movement of the shape, and you don't have to keep your long stitches all the same length and your short stitches all the same length. The idea is that they're a bit more random so they don't look regimented, just so long as you've got one long, one short, one long, one short. So like this one, I think I'm going to bring it even further down because the shape is starting to taper down. And if you miss one, so look, I've got a little bit of a gap there, you can always come back and add a stitch in. Don't have to be too precious about it. So we need a short stitch there. Let's do a long one with a bit of a gap, and then I can add a short stitch in between. Okay. And then another short one here. And once you get kind of roughly to the edge of one side of your motif, all you do is come back. You can jump back, or you can get a new piece of thread and start again in the middle and work out to the other edge. So work out to the right. Okay. I'm going to weave that through because I'm coming to the end of that thread. Okay. And cut that away. Get the next piece of thread. So what did I use? 3 strands. 1, 2. I always separate my strands before I use them, even if I know I've got, say, 3 in there, just because they twist a lot when they're in the skeins. And if I separate them and regroup them, then I know that they're going to lay flatter. So thread my needle. And just for the purpose of speed, I am going to go just up through the back with a knot. I'll just do 1 stitch to anchor that in place. So Janet asks, are you going over the split stitch or keeping it inside? I'm going over it because I want a nice smooth edge. I don't know if you can see that. But essentially when you go over that split stitch outline, you can angle your needle just under the stitches. And it just gives it a nice sort of raised edge to the piece. And again, you can do this when you do satin stitch if you wanted to. Or some stitches it might look better if you've got sort of a rugged edge. But when you do long and short, especially if you're doing different motifs on top of the other, it's good to have that split stitch outline. I don't know if you can see that, but I've got a little bit of a gap. So I'm going to bring in another stitch. Just going to do a random stitch there. Okay, so we'll keep going. Like so. 1 short, 1 slightly longer. 1 short. And this is just one of those techniques that takes a bit of practice before you get it absolutely perfect. But if you've got a nice big piece to work on, then that's the perfect time to practice. So as you can see, it's not regimented. I've got some really short ones at the top and some longer ones that come down the side. It just needs to be a bit random. The more random it is, the more natural it will look, so the less rigid it will look. But the trick is just to have 1 long, 1 short, 1 long, 1 short. So I'm going to finish this bit of thread, and for my next row of stitches I'm actually going to use a mixture. So I'm going to use 2 strands of the dark and 1 strand of the light. Okay, so I'm subtly adding in that lighter colour. So if I can find the end of the thread. Okay, and then I've also got this one, so yeah, subtly adding in that lighter colour, and that will help it shade nicely down the shape. So 2 strands of the darker. Oops. And then 1 of the light. then thread that up. Again, for speed, I'm just going to leave the knot in the back of the fabric, but you can do your 3 little stitches inside your shape. Okay, so next what we're going to do, second row, is we're actually going to bring our thread up through our last stitches and down the shape. Okay, so again, I'm going to start in the middle. I'm going to start with that short stitch that was in the middle. I'm going to bring my needle up through that stitch, and then I'm going to bring my needle down and I'm going to create a long stitch. So wherever you've brought your needle up through a short stitch, you next create a long stitch, and vice versa. So now I'm going to bring my needle up through that long stitch and I'm going to create a short stitch. So you essentially alternate as the rows go on. So again, bring my needle up through that short stitch, and they will sort of blend into one, so you don't need to be too precious about it. Just so long as you've sort of got that alternating rhythm. And as your shape gets smaller, you might find that you have to miss a stitch because you're just not going to fit that many stitches in. So I need a short one here and then a long one. So again, coming up through that stitch and down. So that was a long one. Next one needs to be a short one. And then I could probably fit one more long one in, up through that stitch and down. And when you sort of get to the side, you kind of have to judge whether you're going to go inside the shape or outside the shape. I think I'll go inside for now, and then my next one that I bring up in my next row, I'll go outside that split stitch line, so I know that that line is covered. So I've got a long stitch, so I'm stitching one short one, up through the short stitch, and stitch a long one. Hopefully that makes sense. But again, you're just alternating the long and short. I'm running out of thread, so I need to get another piece of thread. So you just turn it over, weave that through the back of your stitching, and get a new piece of thread. So it's quite a time-consuming technique, but it looks really lovely when it's done. So I've got 2 dark and 1 light to finish off this row. And then for my final row, I'll just do light strands of thread, or I could add 2 more rows and do 2 light and 1 dark in the first one, and then all light in the second one. I think I've probably only got space to do 1 more row after this. So where are we? Up through the short one, down into a long stitch, up through the long stitch and down into a short stitch, although I'm actually going to bring it further than that last one just so that I can taper that shape in. So like I said, it's all about the eye, this one. You kind of just have to see what looks most natural and roll with it. Okay. I'll bring my needle up further up here. I hope you can see the sort of shading effect on the camera. I'll see if I can bring it close in a second. I'm going to bring that stitch over the split stitch outline because I'm not going to be able to cover that. Further down. I think I'm going to do 1 more just to make sure that's a nice curve. So hopefully you can see that shading starting to take place. Okay, my last row I'm just going to do light stitches, but before I do that I've noticed there's a bit of a gap here, so I'm just going to bring my needle up and fill that one in. You can always use your needle just to spread the thread. Okay, happy with that. Weave that through. And then just the light. So I'm just going to cut away these ends so they don't get in the way. So then I want 3 strands of light thread. And again, you don't have to use the same colour. Obviously, if you're doing like a leaf or something, it might make sense to use different shades of green. But you could just mix it up, do whatever you want. You could go purple to yellow to blue if you wanted to. But again, this is a really good technique to use in really big shapes, because as well, if you were going to do a satin stitch across a big shape, it would look nice, it would look really nice, but you might find that you run out of thread really quickly. Whereas if you're just doing these little stitches, you're sort of saving on your thread. You're not just doing one big long stitch over the shape. Okay, so again, bring it up in the middle, go through one of your last stitches. And now, because this is the last row, I'm going to go over the edge of that split stitch outline. And I'm actually going to not take all of my threads over that edge, because if I did, that point would become really bulky. So some of them I'm going to take over, and some of them I'm just going to sort of taper in. So up, take that one over, and again up through here. I'm just going to go underneath that stitch there. I think that could do with maybe one more in there, just so it looks a bit more natural. And again, it's just practice makes perfect really with this one. So again, keeping my stitches long then short, then long then short, going up through the previous stitch and over that split stitch outline. Fit a couple more in. Maybe one more. Have I got enough thread? Just about. Just do one more over the edge to create a nice point. So hopefully that's given you a bit of idea of how you can shade with long and short and sort of the principles of the shape. The trick again is just to taper your stitches, so don't be afraid to miss a stitch as you go smaller and smaller into the shape. If you don't miss any stitches, that's going to be really, really bulky when you get to the point, which is obviously what you don't want. So yeah, I hope that has been helpful. Tomorrow I'm going to show you how to frame your designs in a ring frame, ready to hang. And of course, if you've got any more questions, please just send them my way. And yeah, I'll see you all tomorrow.